Hi Internet! Welcome to the Gredtroin YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I decided to release 16 videos ranking the Final Fantasy games in a variety of categories. Each game has their strengths and weaknesses, so I thought it would be a fun way to compare and contrast the games. These lists are just my personal opinion, trying to balance objectivity and personal preference, and likely failing to satisfy anybody. So, if you disagree with my ranking, which you probably do, let me know your ranking of the subject in the comments below. This video is going to be a little bit different than the others. For the final video in our countdown, I thought it would be fun to do a video where I rank where I believe the general Final Fantasy community ranks the games. I've seen an array of takes on the series over the years through various platforms like message boards, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, listicles, and gaming publications. While there's always vigorous debate, I noticed an overall consensus that emerged pretty consistently. While it's not my preferred ranking of the games, I do think that this is the general perception in the fandom, and among critics. So this is how I believe the general Final Fantasy community ranks the mainline titles and tactics. And for the purposes of this ranking, I do plan on including the expansion content for the MMOs in my analysis. Spoilers are also fair game, so you have been warned. Okay, let's get into the ranking. Number 16, Final Fantasy II. If you look at pretty much any ranking of the mainline Final Fantasy games, you'll consistently see Final Fantasy II at or near the bottom of the list. While some reviewers are willing to give faint praise to the story, which they generally concede is quite impressive for the NES era, the intense difficulty, leveling system, and high encounter rate makes the game a constant punching bag in the community. In Final Fantasy II, instead of traditional level-ups, you level up individual stats based upon your character actions. Attack with swords, your sword stat goes up. Get hit, your HP goes up. Fans argue that the ideas might have been good in concept, but fail in execution. As a story-first player, I really enjoyed Final Fantasy II, but the community clearly disagrees with me. Number 15, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII is another game that gets a lot of hate from the Final Fantasy community. The biggest criticism of the game comes from the linearity of dungeon design for the majority of the adventure, but there are other areas of consistent critique as well. A lot of fans find the story difficult to understand without the usage of lore data logs. Many players find the main cast to be annoying and easy to dislike. Plenty of people hate the dialogue and find it to be quote-unquote anime cringe. There's also a lot of criticism over the story structure, which is derided for being convoluted without purpose. The battle system is also derided by many who argue that with the auto-battle feature, the game just plays itself. These criticisms all have a degree of validity to them. Well, except for the critique of the combat. That's just flat out a bad take. While Final Fantasy XIII has a lot of flaws, they tend to get overblown because it turns out gamer discourse on the internet isn't the most nuanced and thoughtful echo chamber. I know, shocking, right? Still, 13 gets a lot of consistent hate in the community, but there are elements of the game that tend to receive more praise than anything in 2. Even those who hate 13 generally acknowledge the game is one of the most beautiful looking games in the entire series. The soundtrack is generally well received as well, though there is a substantial number of fans who hate on the game's soundtrack as well. Final Fantasy XIII is the cool game to hate, but it has more supporters than 2, saving it from the bottom spot on the list. Number 14, Final Fantasy XI. While a lot of folks have strong opinions on Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy XIII, there's a whole lot less discourse about Final Fantasy XI than either of those two games. The reason? Most fans just skipped 11 and never played it, so they don't really care about it either way. Final Fantasy XI was one of the earliest MMOs, and at the time of release, a good deal of fans turned their nose at the concept of the game, because it wasn't a single-player JRPG. If you wanted to buy it for the PlayStation 2 at launch, you'd need to spend over $100 to get the game and adapter, on top of a monthly subscription fee. For a lot of younger fans, it was an ask too big for their parents, and for older fans, it was too different and too much of a time sink for them to give the game a chance. By the time Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn came out, with faster internet speeds and modern gameplay conveniences, many fans saw no reason to go back to 11 when they had a perfectly fine Final Fantasy MMO to play, and thus 11 became the most consistently skipped game in the series. Most fans don't necessarily hate 11. There are some who do, don't get me wrong, but most have zero opinion on it because they've never even touched it. It doesn't get the same vitriol as 2 and 13, but it does get overlooked consistently. That said, there are a lot of 11 fans, and they love the game. However, they tend to be in their own little bubble separate from the rest of the Final Fantasy community. Because of its niche nature, it takes the number 14 spot on the list. Number 13, Final Fantasy I. Final Fantasy, the game that started it all. This game brought us the crystals, iconic character classes, and memorable music tracks like the prelude and the main theme of the series, classic bosses, and one of the most iconic lines in video game history. It's also dated, a little boring, and very meandering. The story has basically no momentum, it's easy to get lost and not know what to do next, and the content is pretty bare bones compared to later installments. It laid the foundation for the rest of the series, but on its own, it doesn't stand up to the test of time as well as other entries. Final Fantasy I is praised more for the legacy of the game than the game itself. While a lot of people have fun with trying out different job combinations, there are later games in the series that did the job system better. There's basically nothing in Final Fantasy I that isn't done better by a later entry in the series. The reason this game ranks higher than the previous entries is because there are a lot of people who have nostalgia for this game and its old-school traditional gameplay. The leveling system isn't quote-unquote broken like 2's, it's not as linear as 13, and it has a bigger legacy than 11. However, it's still generally agreed to be one of the weaker games in the series, and thus takes the number 13 spot on this list. Number 12, Final Fantasy XV. Similar to Final Fantasy XIII, this is a game that received significant backlash from the Final Fantasy community when it was released. The extremely long development cycle of the game made everyone view the project with a great deal of skepticism. 15 ended up being a very different game from other Final Fantasy games. It was an open-world game with action-based combat, with its story being told through various multimedia, like the Matrix films over a decade prior, and ultimately was viewed as a mixed bag. The game felt incomplete to many fans, both from a gameplay and narrative perspective, which, given the long development history of the game, made it seem like even more of a failure. But there are elements of the game that tended to get praise from the community. The visuals, music, and characters, especially the main villain, all tended to get high praise from fans and first-timers alike. The 15 haters are pretty loud voices in the Final Fantasy community, but when push comes to shove, the general consensus I've seen is that most folks tend to actually enjoy playing 15 more than Final Fantasy I, so it barely ekes it out on this list. Number 11, Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III tends to get praise for its dynamic job system, having a stronger narrative than Final Fantasy I, good exploration, great music, and a stone-cold classic final boss. The incredibly difficult final dungeon is infamous, for better or for worse, and is definitely one of the more legendary aspects of the game. It's also the game that introduced the beloved series staple, Moogles. There's fierce debate as to the validity of the 3D remake's art style and story changes, but the Pixel Remaster's reception has been generally good overall. 3 is continuing to build its reputation in the community and isn't generally disliked as much as any previous game on the list, but it's also very commonly considered to be just a lesser version of another game coming up later in the ranking. Number 10, Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII was very hyped and popular at the time of its release, following up the insanely popular Final Fantasy VII, and a lot of that game's momentum carried over into 8. It has become significantly less popular in the community since its release, and has garnered a lot of criticism over the years. The junction and draw systems are generally hated by fans. The cast has mixed reception at best. The story also has mixed reception. The music, however, is highly praised, and many consider 8 to have the best score in the entire series. A lot of fans also love 8's incredibly fast-paced battle systems, and Triple Triad is very commonly considered to be the greatest minigame in Final Fantasy history. Final Fantasy VIII is a game with a lot of flaws, but it's still one of the most popular games in the series, and generally fans don't say it's out-and-out terrible like a lot of the previous entries, and it definitely has a much bigger fan base than 3. So that's my junctionification for 8 landing in the top 10. I have no junctionification for that dad joke though. Number 9, Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII's reputation has grown a lot over time. While 8 was really beloved when it came out, and gradually diminished in the eyes of fans over time, 12 is the opposite, where it had a mixed response upon initial release, and is now being considered more and more to be a classic for the series. 12 had a much more bland color palette than the previous single-player mainline entry, Final Fantasy X. It also lacked battle music, and played like a single-player MMO, which frustrated fans who intentionally skipped 11. While those criticisms aren't as talked about today, a critique the game had at launch that remains talked about in the present are the characters of Vaan and Penelo, who are often considered 2 of the worst RPG characters ever. They are often cited as being annoying and having no relevance to the plot, and even fans of this game will state they don't like either character. However, there were a lot of things that people liked about 12. Ivalice was one of the most beloved Final Fantasy worlds, and returning to it was met with praise. A lot of Final Fantasy fans liked the more political nature of the plot, and enjoyed that the game was far less anime-influenced than other titles. Exploration in 12 was considered to be genuinely impressive. The Gambit system was also generally well received, and the side quests were also considered to be among the best in the series. I think the remaster of 12 has a lot to do with the game's increased reception over time. The new job system in the remaster gets a lot of love, but honestly, I think it's the 4x battle speed that has saved this game's reputation. And if people still had to play at 1x speed, it wouldn't be nearly as praised as it is these days. Overall, the story and cast of 12 is still generally considered to be among the weaker ones in the series, and it still remains a divisive game with mixed reception. However, the scales in that mixed reception have tipped more towards the positive end of the spectrum in recent years, and 12 nowadays tends to find it lumped alongside the better games in the series. Number 8. Final Fantasy V. From a pure gameplay perspective, Final Fantasy V is often considered to be the best Final Fantasy. The game is famous for its incredibly robust job system, which is basically an evolution and refinement of the same system from 3. The game is funnier and more lighthearted than most of the other games in the series, with comic relief ranging from the inept henchman Gilgamesh, a talking turtle who cracks wise, and a sheep with a bad attitude. It's a fun, breezy adventure that really hooks in the player with its tight gameplay. However, the cast and overall story is considered to be pretty weak in comparison to other entries. That said, the Super Nintendo and PlayStation eras of Final Fantasy games are generally beloved among the fan base. There's more nostalgia for this style of Final Fantasy than 12 among the general fandom, though in recent days I admit that 12 is catching up with 5 in terms of fan reception. So, as of right now, I think 5 is a little less divisive than 12, so it manages to beat it out on this ranking. Number 7. Final Fantasy IV. Many fans argue that Final Fantasy IV is the first Final Fantasy to truly feel like a Final Fantasy game, and is where the series finally began to catch its stride. It's generally considered to be pretty strong across the board. The story is well received, the characters are beloved by fans, the music is considered to be among the best in the series, the gameplay is praised for its balance and innovation in regards to the ATB system. Most fans will say Final Fantasy IV holds up very well, and is one of the best entry points for the series given its classic gameplay mixed with strong story and holding up all these years later. While 4's graphics are much better than the NES-era Final Fantasies, especially with its utilization of new technology like Mode 7, 6 is considered to be the peak of pixel art, and thus 4's graphics don't hold up quite as well in the community. Also, Final Fantasy IV was only the second Final Fantasy game to come out in the US, and the series was gradually becoming more and more popular as time went on. That means that most fans didn't start with 4, while a lot of fans started with 6, so there's a bit less nostalgia for this one in the community. It still has plenty of nostalgia, but nowhere near as much as 6 and 7. Fans also have some criticisms with the story in regards to the game's numerous fake-out deaths and mind control subplots, and so the general consensus about 4 is that it's the first great Final Fantasy, but that the series only got better from here. Number 6. Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics came out at the height of Square's golden age, smack dab in between Final Fantasy VII and VIII. It had a much darker story than most of the series, dealing more with politics and religion than any previous entry. Fans loved the moral ambiguity of the complex narrative equally as much as they loved the incredible gameplay. Tactics further improved upon 5's brilliant job system and mixed it with grid-based tactical combat that proved to be a massive hit with fans. The game's gorgeous pixel art scratched the itch from those who were unsure of the 3D era of Final Fantasy, but was so well done that even those accustomed to 3D graphics were impressed by the game's visuals. Tactics was so beloved by Final Fantasy fans that it not only had 2 sequels, but it spun off into a mainline Final Fantasy game in the form of Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy Tactics was a spin-off game so good that a mainline game is a spin-off of it. Tactics is so good that fans often treat it with the same reverence and respect of mainline titles, as opposed to the more dismissive nature Final Fantasy spin-offs tend to get. It's a monumental title in the series, and has about as strong of a legacy as a game outside of the main series can. Number 5. Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X was the first game in the series with voice acting, a monumental leap forward for the series. The reception of the voice acting is mostly positive, though the acting for Tidus is a bit more divisive, and the laughing scene has been memed to death at this point. That said, overall 10 is considered to be one of the best games in the series, and serves as a bridge between classic Sakaguchi-led Final Fantasy games and the modern era. Most fans generally agree the game has great music, a great cast, beautiful visuals, and a narrative that is both thematically strong and incredibly tightly constructed. While it is linear, it's not as aggressive in its linearity as 13, and is considered to have a good gameplay balance between towns, dungeons, cutscenes, and combat. The sphere grid is well received by fans, as is the combat system allowing you to switch out party members at will and fully control summons. It's been ported to every platform on the planet and continues to sell boatloads each time. It still has an extremely strong legacy, and remains untarnished even by the weirdness of 10-2. While 15 tried to be a Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers, 10 is actually that game, and is often considered a great entry point in the series for more modern players. It holds up strong to this day, and it's a game that many consider to be the last truly great Final Fantasy. 10 has some detractors, but overall, the community is pretty united in their praise of this one. Number 4, Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV fans are basically in a cult. They are probably the most rabid fan base in the fandom, but they're not rabid in a negative way. Instead, they're just overwhelmingly enthusiastic and joyful in their preaching of 14's greatness, and there are a lot of them. Final Fantasy XIV is one of the great success stories in the series. After the abysmal launch of the 1.0 version of the game, 14 was rebuilt from the ground up, and went from being an absolute failure to legitimate competition for dethroning World of Warcraft in the MMO market. It was praised not only as a great MMO, but a great Final Fantasy game with a great story, and each expansion has been extremely well received, continually building the game into a grander and grander narrative. There are tons of fans who consider this game to be the best game in the series because of how much story there is and how high quality said story is. The sentiment is continuing to grow by the day, and it's not uncommon to see people regularly argue that 14 is the best Final Fantasy. I think the ease of access is a strong part of 14's success. Unlike 11, which has a very complicated startup process, 14 is a modern game that's fairly easy to play pretty immediately. And it has an extremely generous free trial that allows completion of A Realm Reborn and the award-winning expansion Heavensward with no restrictions on playtime. This, plus the strong word of mouth, I think led to more people giving it a shot than 11, and it's very common to hear that Final Fantasy fans have at least dabbled in 14, even if they didn't love it or keep playing. The free trial of 14, combined with its strong word of mouth, has led to a lot of players giving the game a shot. 14 has tons of story and tons of content, and it continues to build upon itself in ways that offline entries can't. For this reason, 14 fans feel that the stories of previous games can't even come close in scope, and rank 14 as an easy first place. But, on the flip side, a lot of Final Fantasy fans refuse to play the game simply because it's an MMO, and they continue to write off the genre, same as they did back with 11. There are a lot of fans deeply skeptical of 14 for this reason, and despite its high praise and popularity, it still isn't able to shake off this stigma with a lot of members of the community. And even 14 fans will generally admit that A Realm Reborn, the base game, is pretty weak, and if the first 50 hours of your Final Fantasy game is pretty weak, that's a big ding against it. Still, in spite of these issues, 14 has generally become beloved by the Final Fantasy community, and is commonly considered to be among the very best of the franchise, if not the very best. Number 3, Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is easily the biggest game in the series. It's the game that put JRPGs on the map in the West. It has a classic cast, great world, top-tier music, top-tier villain, and gameplay systems that are incredibly dynamic and fun. The game is commonly criticized for the character graphics outside of battle and a weaker localization, which is fair, but over the years there has been a bit of a popularity backlash against the game. There's a large portion of the fanbase that regularly calls the game trash, and argues it is a bottom-tier game in the series, but that's mostly due to the larger spotlight cast upon 7 due to its massive popularity. While there is that chunk of the fanbase that are active haters of the game, most in the community consider it to be one of the best games in the series, with many ranking it in the top 3 pretty consistently. It's iconic and still beloved by most fans in spite of the backlash from louder corners of the internet, but because there is so much backlash against Final Fantasy VII, I can't rank it any higher than number 3 on this list. Number 2, Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX is considered by many in the community to be the best and most representative game in the Final Fantasy series. It's got a great cast that's full of heart. Vivi, in particular, seems to be the breakout star of this game in the eyes of fans. 9 brought a return to the fantasy-style settings of the game's earlier titles, but embraced the storytelling and enhanced visual techniques pioneered in 7 and 8. What resulted was a best-of-both-worlds Final Fantasy that acted as the perfect summation of the entire series up to that point. It was the last Final Fantasy where the series creator, Hironobu Sakaguchi, had major involvement from a creative standpoint, and it's his personal favorite in the series. The game isn't without critique from fans, though. The slow battles are a consistent subject of criticism, and there are some fans who argue the game has nothing new to offer and only rehashes old ideas. The former criticism is valid, the latter is dumb and wrong. But sadly, there are enough dumb and wrong people who say that consistently enough to tarnish 9's reputation, albeit ever so slightly. In general, 9 is ranked towards the top of Final Fantasy rankings, but the number 1 game on this list has a much stronger cult following of fans. Number 1. Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI is easily the game that most fans and critics of the Final Fantasy series consider to be the best game in the series, at least in the West. The game is famous for having no single main character, and instead boasting a large ensemble cast of memorable heroes. The villain, Kefka, is an icon of video game history, and 6 is one of the rare video games where the villain actually succeeds in destroying the world. The post-apocalyptic world of Ruin is beloved for its open-ended nature. There's also the famous opera scene, perhaps the most iconic cutscene in pixel art history. It's interesting how beloved 6 is by the community and by critics, when it actually didn't sell that well in comparison to other games in the series. Final Fantasy I, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, and 15 all outsold Final Fantasy VI, and it only barely outsold Final Fantasy IV. So why does it get regarded so highly? Well, sales figures do not automatically equate to the quality of a work of art. Second, the game holds up very well for all the reasons I mentioned previously, plus a very dynamic set of gameplay systems that offered a fun amount of customization options. Third, the game is arguably the peak of the pixel art genre, which is a style in particular there is a lot of nostalgia for, as it was the visual style that the earliest video games adopted, and thus 6 sort of acts as the end of gaming history's childhood era. But I think 7's backlash actually helped 6 a lot in terms of its standing. Early message board adopters were older and had played 6 before 7, and most game journalists had also played 6 before 7. So a narrative was pushed about an older, more obscure, and cooler title that was the one that really deserved the spotlight, and the narrative was born. The narrative spread like wildfire, and nowadays you'll find plenty of 6 fans who will go out of their way to tell you how much better 6 is than the other games in the series. While I do think 6 is an excellent game, I found a loud portion of its fan base to be the most toxic of any mainline game. I debated addressing this in a more politic way, but I think it is worth mentioning. In my experience, more than any other mainline game in the series, 6 fans will deride on other games in the series when talking about the game. You'll see a thread on a completely different Final Fantasy game, and 6 fans will come in and say that 6 is so much better. If someone is making a video, essay, or post about 6, it would begin with trashing another game in the series, and then listing 6 as the better alternative. I've seen this time and time again on many different forms of social media, like message boards, Facebook groups, YouTube videos and comments, articles, you name it. I had no plans on mentioning this here, because admittedly this is anecdotal and would be incredibly difficult to gather scientific data proving what percentage of online discourse about Final Fantasy VI meets the criteria I'm laying out, and I do not think that every fan approaches 6 discourse in this way. One could argue that my own biases are showing me what I want to see, rather than what is actually there, and I acknowledge that possibility. However, as I was in the process of making these videos, I played a short little RPG called Bear's Restaurant, which is a very excellent, short 3 to 5 hour RPG with an incredibly beautiful and moving story. In the post-game, you can talk with an author insert character who will discuss some of their biggest RPG influences, and if you talk about Final Fantasy, they will literally begin by trashing on 7 and proclaiming 6 is better. It's as clear-cut of an example of this phenomenon as one can get, and though the author has a greater level of self-awareness than I see in a lot of said discourse, it still falls into the same trap of harping on another game, specifically 7, to sing the praises of 6. Again, I think Bear's Restaurant is an excellent game, and one I definitely recommend, but it's a perfect encapsulation of what I consider to be a big part of the problem around 6's discourse. Rather than just singing the game's praises, of which there are many, I see so many fans feeling the need to knock down games that sold better in order to bolster 6 up, whereas I think the game should just stand on its own merits. While these folks may make up a loud segment of the fan base, most don't argue with 6 fans because most fans of the Final Fantasy series generally agree that the game is really good. I think it's all of these factors combining together to create the meta-narrative that 6 is the best game in the series. And while I'm personally not a fan of this meta-narrative, it doesn't mean I'm not a fan of the game and don't think it's excellent. And whether or not I think it's the best game in the series is irrelevant here. This is a video where I discuss the general consensus on the Final Fantasy games, and the general consensus among fans and critics alike is that Final Fantasy VI is the best game in the series. Do you guys agree with my assessment of how the fan community generally views the games? This is less about my personal opinion of the games themselves, but more trying to accurately gauge the response of the community and critics, so I'm curious to see whether or not you agree with my assessment. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for watching this video.